If you wish to become a billionaire, understand first that almost everyone who attempts this fails completely, quietly, without any cinematic moment marking the end, and you begin at 19 years old in a cramped apartment shared with two roommates studying for exams you have already decided not to finish, typing code or drafting a business plan at 3 in the morning, because the idea living in your head simply will not let you sleep. Not out of romantic obsession, but out of a genuine, almost uncomfortable certainty that you have noticed something about the world nobody else has fully articulated yet. And so you drop out, walking away against the quiet horror of parents who spent years and considerable money on an education you are now abandoning for an idea that, to them, sounds indistinguishable from 100 other doomed projects they've heard about from other people's children. You max out a credit card building the first version of whatever you are building, teaching yourself complex skills you simply cannot afford to pay someone else for, coding through grueling nights that blur silently into mornings. You learn quickly that the actual daily texture of early entrepreneurship has almost nothing to do with high-level vision and almost everything to do with an exhausting, unglamorous accumulation of endless problems. The reality isn't keynote speeches, it's administrative friction, figuring out how to incorporate a company, decoding tax obligations you were never taught in school, and negotiating with vendors who refuse to take you seriously because you look, and often are, barely out of your teens. You pitch your idea to your first potential investor, and you are rejected within minutes. The meeting ends so fast, you are back out on the sidewalk before you have even fully processed what happened, and so you pitch again. And again. Dozens of times over the following months, refining the same core idea slightly differently every single time, absorbing a constant barrage of rejection that would be soul-crushing if you allowed yourself to actually feel it. You learn early the specific defense mechanism that separates surviving founders from those who quietly give up. An ability to treat every single rejection as data rather than a final verdict. Extracting whatever useful criticism exists inside a dismissive no and discarding the rest before it can settle permanently into your self-worth. You eventually secure a small amount of funding, a check from a friend, a family member, or an angel investor willing to take a high-risk bet on you specifically, not because your business plan is flawless, but because something about your specific intensity convinces them you will simply refuse to stop trying regardless of how hostile the environment becomes. That funding, modest by any serious industry standard, feels at the time like more money than you have ever been responsible for in your entire life. And you spend every single dollar with a paranoid, obsessive carefulness because you understand immediately the brutal reality of capital. Running out of money means the absolute end of everything you have already sacrificed to get this far. You hire your first employee in your early 20s, discovering quickly that leading another human being who depends on you for their livelihood carries a psychological weight entirely different from anything you experienced building alone. You make payroll some months by quietly transferring your own meager personal savings into the company account, eating the cheapest food you can find, sleeping on a thin mattress on the floor of an apartment you can barely afford, because you have already decided that your own comfort is the first and most negotiable expense whenever the company needs it, a brutal lesson that sits uncomfortably against every instinct you were raised with about taking care of yourself first. Your product fails publicly during an early launch, a catastrophic technical failure, or a fundamental miscalculation about what customers actually wanted. You watch the small audience you spend agonizing months building lose interest and drift away within days. And you sit with that specific humiliating failure for exactly as long as you can afford to, which is rarely more than a single sleepless night, before forcing yourself right back to work because you have already learned the coldest truth of this world. Entrepreneurship offers zero institutional sympathy for grief. The market simply moves forward with or without you, and your only real choice is whether you move forward alongside it. You rebuild the product from a foundation of hard lessons rather than the naive optimism you started with, talking directly to potential customers in a way you were too confident to bother with the first time. And a smaller, far more carefully targeted version of your idea begins gaining genuine traction modest but real growth that feels, after the previous failure, disproportionately thrilling. You raise a larger funding round in your mid-20s, sitting across the table from institutional investors who ask questions specifically designed to find the deep weaknesses in your plan. You learn to answer with a composed confidence that took considerable practice to develop, because you understand that investors are evaluating not just your business model, but your specific psychological capacity to remain steady when the idea inevitably encounters serious trouble later. You hire aggressively as growth accelerates, and you discover, often painfully, that finding talented people is far easier than finding people who share your specific, obsessive standards. You make hiring mistakes that cost the company real money and real time, and you make firing decisions that keep you awake at night in a completely different way than the early sleepless nights once did. Understanding now that every termination affects a real person's mortgage and family, regardless of how clearly the business case for the decision presents itself on paper. A weight you never once anticipated back when the company was still small enough that you knew every employee's name and most of their spouses' names too. You experience your first genuine existential crisis for the company in your late 20s. A larger, far better funded competitor enters your exact market with resources you simply cannot match. You spend weeks genuinely believing the entire venture might collapse, working with a desperate intensity that damages your health in ways you will not fully register until years later. And you survive that crisis not through a single brilliant strategic maneuver, but through an accumulation of small, disciplined decisions made under sustained pressure, cutting costs ruthlessly, focusing the product far more narrowly than you originally wanted to, outlasting a competitor who, it turns out, had far less genuine commitment to the specific problem you were both solving. Your personal relationships absorb the cost of this period the way they absorb it for almost everyone on this specific path. A long-term relationship quietly ends because your partner simply cannot continue building a life around someone who is functionally unavailable during every single waking hour. You grieve that loss the exact same compartmentalized way you grieved the product failure years earlier, quickly, privately, because the company's problems do not pause to accommodate your personal ones. You tell yourself in the loneliest moments that this sacrifice is temporary, though privately you have already begun to suspect that this specific temporariness may simply be a permanent condition of the path you have chosen. You raise a significant funding round in your early 30s that fundamentally changes the scale of the company, bringing in institutional investors who now sit on your board, expecting a level of financial reporting and governance discipline that feels at first like a total loss of the creative freedom you once took for granted. You learn to lead an organization that is no longer fully yours in the way it once was, balancing your own raw instincts against a board with genuine legal authority over major decisions. A constant negotiation that never fully resolves and instead becomes a permanent, ongoing skill you will continue refining for the rest of your career. You expand into new markets and product lines in your mid-30s. The company now employs hundreds of people whose livelihoods depend entirely on decisions you make in rooms they will never personally enter. And the specific heavy isolation of that responsibility settles into you permanently, a growing awareness that very few people around you can offer genuinely disinterested advice anymore, because almost everyone in your orbit now has some financial or professional stake in your continued success. You learn to seek counsel specifically from a small handful of people entirely outside your company, people who have absolutely nothing to gain or lose from whatever you eventually decide. You take the company public in your late 30s, an event that transforms your theoretical wealth into something concrete and publicly documented for the first time. Your net worth is suddenly a matter of public record. Journalists and strangers online calculating and endlessly discussing a number that represents to you something far more complicated than money. An entire decade and a half of sacrificed relationships, failed launches, and sleepless nights compressed into a single figure, a number that people who have never built anything themselves now feel entirely entitled to have loud, confident opinions about. You cross into extraordinary wealth sometime in this period, and the moment itself, when you finally notice it happening, produces almost none of the euphoria you might have imagined as a 19-year-old coding through the night in a cramped apartment. Instead, it arrives as a strange, disorienting anticlimax because the specific grinding problems occupying your attention on that particular day have nothing to do with your net worth at all. You understand, for the first time with real clarity, the ultimate truth of financial scale. Wealth at this level stops functioning as a meaningful personal marker and starts functioning instead as an abstract number attached to a company that still every single day needs you to solve entirely ordinary operational problems. Your public visibility increases dramatically, and you discover an entirely new category of exhausting labor you never once anticipated when you started: managing a public persona, choosing words in interviews with the same careful precision you once reserved for life or death investor pitches, understanding that a single careless sentence can instantly move your company's stock price or damage relationships with regulators that took painful years to build. You hire people specifically to manage this dimension of your life because you can no longer navigate it safely alone. A dedicated team whose entire job is protecting a tailored version of your own image, a separate, far more polished person that you now have to keep performing consistently. You face your first serious public controversy in your 40s, a product failure or a controversial leadership decision that draws sustained, hostile media coverage. You learn that the specific brutality of public criticism at this scale bears absolutely no relationship to fairness or accuracy. Strangers who have never met you form confident, permanent opinions about your character based on a single, rapid news cycle. And you learn, slowly and at real emotional cost, to separate your self-worth from a public narrative you cannot fully control, regardless of how much money or legal counsel you throw at managing it. In your later career, you begin directing massive resources toward philanthropy and new, high-risk ventures completely unrelated to the empire that made you, driven partly by genuine conviction and partly by a specific private restlessness that financial success alone can no longer satisfy. An itch that feels uncomfortably like the exact same hunger that kept you awake at 19 in that cramped apartment, except now aimed at problems vastly larger than a single company. You are asked occasionally by a young founder seeking advice before their own first pitch meeting whether the entire journey was genuinely worth its cost. The failed relationships, the health damaged by years of insufficient sleep, the specific isolation of leading an organization where almost nobody around you can offer entirely disinterested counsel anymore. You consider the question longer than they expect, thinking about every employee whose family now depends on a company that exists only because you refuse to stop trying. After your first product failed publicly, and every relationship that quietly ended while you were somewhere else, solving a problem that felt, at the time, far more urgent than it probably actually was. And you tell them the absolute truth, that this path will extract a genuine, permanent cost from nearly every other part of your life, but that for the specific kind of restless, obsessive mind that cannot rest until an idea living inside it becomes real, there was never actually a meaningfully different path available to choose instead. And somewhere right now, in a cramped apartment, in a city nobody expects anything from, a 19-year-old is typing code at 3 a.m, kept awake by a genuine, uncomfortable certainty that they have noticed something about the world nobody else has fully articulated yet. With absolutely no understanding yet of the rejections, the failed launches, the relationships this single sleepless night is quietly setting into motion, or what it might feel like, after everything, to finally notice on some entirely ordinary afternoon consumed by ordinary operational problems that the number attached to their name has crossed into territory almost nobody on earth ever reaches at all.